Hello! I want to show you today how you can bind your quilt by your machine and do it perfectly without any overlap or mistakes, just like I've got here on this quilt. So this is something that I see a lot of beginner quilters especially struggle with, and it's something that I had trouble with too for quite a while. It didn't really click for me until I had started working at my local quilt shop, and part of my job for the quilt samples that we made was to bind them as well. So I ended up getting a lot of practice very quickly, and I figured out a few things. And I want to show you today what I have figured out to make machine binding easy and come out clean with these mitered corners each time. So let me show you my ways. I am Kate from Due North Handmade. Welcome to my sewing room, and let's get binding today. In this video today, I'm going to cover how to bind your quilt. And I'm going to do that by starting with how to prepare your binding, then how to sew it onto one side of your quilt, what to do when you get to a corner, how to join the ends of the binding once you get all the way around your quilt, and then finally, I'm going to show you how you sew it to the other side. So this is going to show you some tips and tricks for how to set up your machine and how to make this as successful as possible. So let's get started. You'll see here I have my quilt. From a previous video, I had showed you how I basted it. I have since quilted it up, doing just some swirly designs, and I added some embellishment here with some chenille. So that'll be fun once I get this all finished and washed up. But we're going to use this quilt, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to bind it. So first, my binding fabric here, for this one, I'm going to use scraps of my backing. You can use scraps of your backing, you can use new fabric that you can cut into, you could use strips from a jelly roll or other pre-cuts, or you can go scrappy, it doesn't matter. But what it comes down to is I always use a 2.5 inch wide strip. And that doesn't matter if I'm using a quilt that has minky or cotton or a thicker batting or a thinner batting. 2.5 inches works really, really well in all those situations. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut these 2.5 inch wide strips. I'm going to start with one of these pieces here. So I have it folded in half once. I'm going to cut it folded. If you do this, don't cut more, or don't have more than one fold in the piece of fabric at once, because otherwise it can get sort of crooked. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to move this so that you can see the fold. To get it started, I'm first going to have to even up one side so I can cut my strips. So I'm going to take a line of my ruler right here and make sure it's lined up even on my fold. So that way I know that when I unfold the fabric, it's going to be straight even where it was folded when I cut it. So I'm going to go right down the line. And now I have an even edge to start with. And I'm going to do the same, just cutting 2.5 inch strips, lining up 2.5 inches here, and at the fold, making sure that I am even with a line on my ruler. So even here, even here. We have 2.5 inches. Here is one strip. I'm going to repeat doing that until I have enough strips of fabric to go all the way around my quilt. How do you know how much fabric you need? Well, it's pretty easy to figure out. If you could go onto an online calculator. There's lots out there that will show you how to do it, but it is not too difficult. So you know the size of your quilt, or you can measure the size of your quilt. All you're going to have to do is add up the total distance around the entire edge of the quilt, so the perimeter of your quilt. If you are doing a quilt that is 50 inches by 60 inches, well, it's 50 plus 50 plus 60 plus 60. So that would be 100 plus another 120, 220 inches. With your typical width of fabric being 44 inches as a good assumption, now all you got to do, get a calculator out and say, all right, how many how many times does 44 inches go into whatever your perimeter is? So 240 divided by 44. I can't do that in my head. I'll pull out the calculator and find out how many strips of fabric I'll need. Whatever, it's going to be usually some whole number plus a fraction. Always round up, right? Because you're going to need to cut that full strip and not have, you know, a fraction of a strip that you cut. Whatever you don't use, you can just save for later. But now I know that for this particular quilt, I'm gonna need a little over 6 strips if this was a regular 44-inch with the fabric. Since I'm using scraps of my backing, I'm just sort of cutting strips, and I know I'll have enough because it was cut from around the quilt on all sides, so there's at least as much as going to cover on all sides. Pretty simple. I'm going to continue cutting these, and then I will show you next how we are going to sew them together. Back in a minute. All right, to start off joining these strips of fabric, I'm going to find the ends, take it right side up, take the next one, put the right sides together, and I'm going to overlap them like this at a 90-degree angle. And I'm going to sew across the waist of it, not the crotch. You don't want to go across the crotch of the 2 legs. You want to go across the waist, right there on that diagonal. You can mark this if you want. I am using my handy dandy magic seam tape and lining up that intersection with my red line, which is my stitching line, and I'm just gonna sew down the waist of these 2 pieces of fabric. Once I get to the end, I'm going to open it up. See how it's flat there and straight? That sewing across the diagonal is also going to strengthen this piece, because binding is where there is a lot of tension that gets put on a quilt as it's moved around and picked up and folded and whatnot. So it's going to make that seam a little stronger by being done at the diagonal on the bias of the fabric rather than doing it straight with the weave itself. So we're going to repeat and sew all of my strips together in the same manner here. All right, so now at each point where I have sewn that seam, I'm going to cut off this extra bit. You can do this with your rotary cutter. I'm just going to do it with scissors here, so that you have basically a 1/4 inch seam allowance or more, doesn't really matter on this one. I'm going to press these seams open. That's important. You don't want to have a lot of bulk in one spot if you can avoid it on your binding here. Nice and pressed. I'm going to repeat and do the same with all of the other seams that I've just sewn on this strip of binding. All right, I've backed out a little bit so you can see my setup here. I have a pretty big sewing table relative to what I used to have, really. And that's really helpful for holding the weight of the quilt while I'm binding. If you don't have a big surface like this, pull up a chair or something next to you so that as you're working, that can hold on to the weight of the quilt and keep it from pulling away from your machine while you're trying to work at it. So let me bring you down closer to my machine again. And I'm going to do this so hopefully you'll be able to see as much of the view here as possible. But I've got my prepared binding strip now, 2.5 inches wide, sewn together on the diagonal with all of my seams pressed open. When I'm sewing it to my quilt, if you're doing this completely by machine, sew it to the back first. So if you're going to do it by hand, typically you'd sew it to the front and then you're going to hand stitch it to the back. But by machine, sew it to the back first and you'll do the front second. I'm also going to add my labels on my quilt. And I'm going to do that before I start sewing the binding down. I like to put my labels in the bottom left-hand corner, which would be this corner here. Double check, make sure, because I've got, yep, the text is going the right way on the panel here. So I'm going to put my labels here in my bottom left corner. I'm doing these with hang tags. If you're going to sew in a label underneath the binding, you could sew that along there now before you get into it. So give me a moment to just sew on my labels, and then I'll get started sewing the binding on. All right, so I have my labels in my bottom left corner. I'm going to start sewing my binding on this bottom edge of the quilt here. I do not press my binding in half for most of my binding. If I'm doing something where I'm going to big stitch bind it later, I will, but that's the only time I do. Otherwise, I leave it unpressed here, and I will fold it as I go, meeting the sides there. So when you get started, you're not going to start right at the edge of the binding strip. I'm starting about 12 inches down, and I'm going to put it right here against the edge of my quilt. As far as thread color for this step, it doesn't matter because it's not going to be visible. I do like to try finding something in my stash that is sort of close to my binding color. I'm more of a use what you have sort of girl, so you know, I'm not going to rush out and go buy the exact color of sage green that I'm using here, but I have a lighter green that's close enough, and so that's what we're going to do. But starting at 12 inches down, leaving this tail, and I'm going to start sewing this on, but not at a 1/4 inch. I'm going to go slightly over a 1/4 inch seam, and I know on my machine that this mark here on my faceplate, let me zoom in a little bit more. So I know that this first dash, that's where my 1/4 inch is. I'm going to sew sort of in between those two so that it's a little bit over a 1/4 inch seam as I am sewing. Back up so you can see how I'm going to do this here. Matching up the two raw edges against the raw edge of the quilt. And you can start sewing it down with a little back stitch. Keep it in place. And I'm going to take this mostly to the corner of the quilt, but not all the way to the corner of the quilt. All right, so right here is my corner. I'm going to stop about a 1/4 inch away. And at that point, I'm going to pivot and sew from that 1/4 inch directly to the corner, so it'll look like a diagonal line going to the corner when I get there. I'm doing this, I can feel the edge of the quilt. I can see just a little bit of the tip here where the corner of the quilt top is. So I'm going to make sure that I stop a little bit before that and go diagonally to the corner. Pivoting 45 degrees and going to the corner, giving it a back stitch, a couple of stitches. So you'll be able to see that I have gone straight and then diagonally gone to the corner of the quilt. When I get to this point, I'm going to take my binding. I'm going to use that diagonal line as a guide and fold it up so that the raw edge is a continuation of the raw edge of the quilt here. So it's going to make like a 45-degree angle here. And now something that is really, really helpful when you get it folded back down is to use a stiletto. So one of these tools that has the metal point here, I'm going to lay it right at the edge of my quilt and fold it back so that I'm lining up the raw edges there, but this is holding it in place and it's holding it straight against the edge of the quilt. Now I just remove that, and now I'm going to sew from the edge of the quilt down and repeat the process when I get to the next corner. I'm going to speed up the camera, speed up the filming when I do this, and slow it down at the next corner so you can see me do it again. Right, here we are coming to the next corner. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to zoom in this time so you can see it closer. And there it is. Folding my binding up, keeping my raw edges together. Using my stiletto. And starting again. I'm going to continue to do this around the entire quilt, and I'm going to stop when I get to a point that is about 12 inches away from where I started. All right, as I come close to the end here, I'm going to stop so that I'm about 12 inches away from this point where I started. So that'd be somewhere right around that loopy loop. So we'll stop. Give it a little back stitch and cut the thread. Now I have to join these two strips of binding, where I started and where I ended. There is a trick to this that involves no measuring, works no matter how wide your binding is, and it works without any special tools. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay one end of my binding. In this case, it's the tail from where I started. I'm just going to lay it all the way along that edge of the quilt, and I'm going to get a pin or a clip just to hold it in place here. And I'm going to take the end of the binding and snip a little off. This is going to be what I use to measure. That's my width of the binding. So that's how wide of an overlap I'm going to need. Let me show you what I mean. So I've got my other tail now. So this is the end from where I ended after going all the way around. And I'm going to take that and I'm going to lay it on top of the other piece of binding. And I'm going to pin it in place somewhere. This is where the stitching starts. I'm going to pin it in place somewhere kind of over here and keep it down. So at this point I have the two tails of the binding overlapping each other flat against the edge of the quilt. My little piece that I used as a guide, I'm going to use this and I'm going to cut the top piece that's laying here lined up with this side, and the bottom piece lined up with this side. So I'm going to kind of slip it in between. I'm going to do the bottom piece first, lifting it up and being careful not to snip my quilt or the other binding. And that's going to be the end of the bottom binding there. Take this whole thing, keep it in place. And now this top piece is going to be cut right along the edge on this side, so that I'm going to end up with a 2.5 inch wide overlap, which is the width of my binding here. So I'm going to end up with an overlap that is the same width as my binding strip. Remove those pins. Don't need that piece anymore, but you'll see I've got 1, 2, and that they'll overlap by 2.5 inches. Next, to join them, I'm going to take this top piece and I'm just going to open it up and lay it like this. Move my pins out of the way. And the other piece, I'm going to leave it as it is right now, open it up so that I see the wrong side. Just like when I was doing the strips, sewing all the strips together to make one long strip, I'm going to do the same thing here. So I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to directly put it on top of this one, perpendicular just like before, lining up the edge that I just cut with the edge of the binding strip there. And I'm going to put a pin in it to hold it in place. I'm just going to move my quilt, sort of pinch a little in to take some of the strain off the 2 pieces of binding. And because I left several inches on either side, I've got a little room to maneuver here. So now, just like before, I'm going to sew across the waist, not the crotch, but the waist of the 2 strips here. All right, I'm gonna check, make sure that nothing got twisted. So I pull it and it's more or less laying flat without a twist in it along my binding. So I've got to trim off this corner. And I'm just gonna give it a finger press here rather than pressing it over at my station. With that finger press, again, I'm going to fold it back together. And now I'm just going to finish sewing that open raw edge. And there we go. That's where I joined it, right on that seam. You can't even tell that that's where the join happened. It looks the same as all the other seams on the binding. So that's how you sew it onto the back side. Now we're going to do the other side of the quilt. You could take it over and you could press this out now if you want that nice crisp line. Again, you don't have to. But if you're going to press your binding, this would be the time that I would say to do it. Don't do it before you sew it on, but do it now, because now it's lined up with both edges stable and together, and so you'll get right along the middle. All right, so we've got the front of our quilt now, and the reason that we're sewing it onto the front last is because when you're doing it by machine, you're going to see the stitching and you want it to look nice. So you want it to look even, and it's a lot harder to do that when you're doing it blind. So if you've got the front here and then you're sewing it across, it's a lot harder to make sure that you're exactly catching the binding and not wiggling back and forth. But if it's on the back, it doesn't matter. As long as it's straight and secure, it doesn't matter at all. It's still going to look great. So I'm going to start here and I'm going to fold my binding over. I'm going to zoom in so you can see a little bit closer. When I'm folding it over, I'm going to aim for getting this crease just past my line of stitching. So there's my line of stitching. We're going just past it. And I'm going to stitch it down and I'm going to aim just inside the crease so that I am pretty darn close to on top of that other stitching line. If I'm not exactly on top of it, again, we're doing this blind. We can't really see exactly where it is. If I'm not exactly on top, it is still okay. Get this line back up here. Again, just get that fold of the binding right past that stitching line, and I'm going to stitch just inside of the seam, of the fold rather, of the binding. Once you start getting a feel for what this looks like and on your particular machine setup, with the foot you have, with the plate you have, with your binding, like now I kind of have an idea that I'm going to see a little bit on this side of the foot. That's another kind of visual indication, another thing to aim for, while I'm sewing just a little bit on the inside of the seam, while also making sure that while we fold over, that fold is just slightly past the stitching line. A lot of things to think about, but it starts to become something that you'll feel in your fingertips, and it'll become very much second nature. Stop about 3 inches away and keeping my needle down. I'm going to get this folded up and in place. So on the back, we kind of have a little bit of this fold here along the edge of the quilt. If you pull that out, it might lay flat or you might get a little pucker on the back here. This is, again, a great application of using your stiletto. So I'm going to use that and just help it to fold back in so that I get a nice diagonal line there from the fold of the binding. Then I'm going to take the binding on this edge after the corner, fold it up. It's helpful to do a pin or a clip here just to keep it there while you're working on the corner. I'm going to do the same all the way to the corner, and again, using my stiletto like before, I'm going to run it along and smooth it down so that I'm pushing that fabric all the way flat against the side of the quilt here, so that when I get to that corner, I'm going to have that nice mitered edge. I'm going to use it to hold it in place while I'm sewing so I don't accidentally sew through my finger. And I'm going to take it so that I am a stitch beyond that mitered edge. Lift up my foot, pivot my quilt with that pin there holding it in place. I'm just going to keep it there for a moment, and then I'm going to start sewing down this side just like before. And again, as I am folding it over, trying to aim to keep that fold of the binding just past the seam line. And now I'm going to sew all the way down this side. And look at that, we are almost at the end. Here's where I started. Overlap my stitching just a little bit, little back stitch, keep it strong, and we are done. You can see here's what the corners look like when you do it this way, from the front and the back. And you can see it doesn't matter if you stitch directly on or a little bit off on the back. It's still going to look even, it's still going to look nice. And the main thing is on the front, it's going to be even and it's going to look nice. So I will machine bind nearly every single one of my quilts, even the ones that I've entered in competition and I've won ribbons on. I have machine bound all of those. Machine binding is just easier for me, and I like the ease, I like the speed, and now I am done and I have a finished quilt, and you can too. You know, all my tips and tricks for getting great results machine binding with mitered corners and joined pieces, and you can go forth and conquer your binding woes now. So there you have it. You can machine bind It is easy. You can do it. I have faith in you. Thank you for hanging out with me in my sewing room today. Again, I am Kate with Due North Handmade. If you like my videos, please like this one and subscribe to my channel, and I will continue to show you how you can do all of these quilty things, and you can make them look professional, and you can make them look nice so that they will hold up and be loved for years and years to come. Happy quilting, my friends. Until next time, have a great time. Bye.